Montana Territory, 1869. The summer had been cruel that year, leaving the earth cracked and dry beneath a merciless sun. The river that once roared with life now whispered faintly as it slipped between the stones. Jacob Turner, a quiet farmhand with hands roughened by years of labor, walked the river's edge, collecting wild herbs for his mother's medicine chest. The only sound was the rustle of pine needles in the breeze, until a faint cry broke the silence, so fragile it could have been mistaken for the wind. He stopped, listening. It came again, low, desperate. Cautiously, Jacob moved toward the sound, rifle slung over his shoulder. The forest opened into a clearing by the riverbank, and there she was. A young native woman, her skin ghostly pale, her dark hair matted against her cheek. Her dress was torn, one leg streaked with blood, the wound clumsily wrapped with a strip of deerskin. She tried to lift her head, but the effort sent her collapsing into the mud again. For a long moment, Jacob just stood there, unsure whether to move closer or leave her be. He had heard stories, raids, ambushes, the kind that left both settlers and natives bitter and scarred. But looking at her now, he saw no threat, only a dying girl. The rifle hung loose in his hand as he knelt beside her. Her lips moved faintly. "Water," she whispered. He tipped his canteen to her mouth, watching as her cracked lips parted to drink. When she finished, her eyes, dark, wary, beautiful, lifted to his. She didn't beg, didn't plead. She only looked, as if daring him to decide her fate. Jacob hesitated. No man in Dry Creek would help a native girl. They'd call him a fool, or worse, a traitor. But his heart, stubborn and soft in a way he often hated, wouldn't let him walk away. He slid his arms beneath her light frame and carried her from the river, feeling her trembling against him. She weighed almost nothing, like a shadow barely clinging to life. The long walk home through the woods was silent, except for the whisper of the wind and her shallow breaths against his chest. By the time he reached his cabin, night had fallen. The sky was bruised purple, thunder rolling far off in the hills. Jacob pushed open the door and laid her gently on his bed, the only bed he owned. She stirred faintly, eyes flickering open, confusion crossing her face. "You're safe," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure it was true. She didn't understand his words, but something in his tone must have reached her. Her body relaxed slightly. He lit the fire, then set to work. His mother had taught him the old ways, the healing plants, the uses of honey and bark. He crushed green leaves into a thick paste and mixed it with a spoonful of honey, spreading it carefully over the angry wound on her leg. She winced but didn't resist. When he tied a strip of clean cloth around the bandage, she looked at him with a gaze that seemed to hold 100 questions. Rain began to patter on the roof, steady and cold. Jacob sat beside the fire, watching her breathe. The flickering light made her skin glow warm against the rough wool blanket. He wondered who she was, what tribe, what family, what story had brought her here to die alone by the river. She shifted slightly in her sleep, murmuring something in a language he couldn't understand. It was soft, rhythmic, like a prayer. Hours passed. The storm grew stronger outside, but inside the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. Jacob dozed in his chair, his boots still wet, his hat hanging by the door. Each time the thunder rolled, she stirred, and he would glance over, afraid she'd slip away again. But she didn't. The fever still clung to her, yet her breathing steadied, her color returning little by little. Sometime before dawn, she opened her eyes. "Kaya," she whispered weakly. Jacob frowned. "Kaya?" he repeated, not sure if it was a word or a name. She nodded faintly. "My name?" He smiled then, just a small, uncertain smile that reached his tired eyes. "Jacob," he said, touching his chest. "My name's Jacob." She blinked at him, and for a fleeting second, the distance between their worlds, her tribe and his, her pain and his silence, seemed to fade. The fire popped softly, sending sparks into the dark. He gave her a sip of warm broth, helping her sit up against the pillow. Her fingers brushed his hand, cool, fragile, but alive. When she drifted back to sleep, Jacob leaned back in his chair, watching her face in the firelight. There was something both fierce and broken in her features, something that told of survival and loss. Outside, the rain slowed, and the first faint streaks of dawn touched the horizon. Jacob rose quietly and stepped to the doorway. The storm had washed the world clean. The air smelled of pine and earth. The river glinted silver in the distance. He took a long breath, feeling the weight of what he'd done. In saving her, he had crossed a line, one that might cost him his place in the valley. But as he looked back at the sleeping girl, wrapped in his blanket, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. Some acts, he thought, didn't need permission. Some people were just meant to be found, and as the morning light spilled across the cabin floor, Jacob Turner realized that this stranger, this wounded woman from another world, had already begun to change his own. Jacob woke before dawn, the first light spilling across the cabin floor. Kaya slept beside the fire, her dark hair loose over the blanket, her face calm now, no longer shadowed by pain. He stepped outside, breathing the cold air, listening to the river whisper below the hill. For days he had cared for her with leaves and honey, doing what his mother once taught him to do for the wounded. But this morning, something in his chest felt heavier, something he could not name. A longing that frightened him more than any storm. He spent the morning chopping wood, trying to silence the thoughts rising inside him. The rhythm of the axe echoed through the trees, yet each swing seemed to carry her face with it. When he returned to the cabin, she was awake, sitting up slowly, the wool blanket around her shoulders. "Morning," he said quietly. She smiled faintly and touched her chest. "Morning," she repeated, her voice soft, uncertain with his words. He laughed under his breath. It was the first sound of joy either had heard in a long time. That day, he taught her to stand again. Her leg trembled, weak but alive. He held her hands, guiding her step by step, feeling the warmth of her skin against his rough palms. Outside, the sunlight danced through the pine branches, turning the dust to gold. She looked up, eyes wide, as if she had forgotten what sunlight felt like. For a moment, the world seemed smaller, only the cabin, the woods, and the fragile bond between them. Neither of them spoke, yet everything that mattered was already said. At night, when the fire cracked and wind howled through the logs, she told him stories in her tongue. He didn't understand all the words, but her gestures painted pictures. The mountains where her people rode, the songs they sang to the river spirits, the dances they made for the moon. Her laughter, soft and shy, filled the room like a forgotten melody. Jacob sat there, watching her hands move through the firelight, thinking how strange it was that someone who had almost died could make the night feel so alive. When her fever had gone completely, she began to help him, grinding herbs, boiling water, tending the small garden outside. Sometimes they walked to the river together, where she would trace shapes in the sand, teaching him her language. "Nia," she said one evening, pointing at the sky. "Sky," he echoed. She smiled. "Water," he said next, tapping the river. "Tayen," she replied softly. The exchange felt sacred, as if words themselves were gifts. With each lesson, a wall between them crumbled, replaced by something unspoken and tender. Jacob had always been a quiet man. He knew the language of tools, of horses, of silence, but not of hearts. Yet one night, when she placed his hand over her chest, he felt that silence break. Her eyes held his, steady and warm. "You give life back," she whispered. "In my people's way, that means you are chosen." He froze, unsure if he had heard her right. "Chosen," he repeated. She nodded, pressing his hand a little tighter. "You are my chosen one." The words hung in the air, delicate as falling snow. Outside, the stars burned white and endless. He wanted to speak, to tell her that he was just a man, awkward, unworthy, still untouched by love, but her gaze silenced him. For a long time they sat there, neither moving, the fire casting their shadows onto the wall. The night seemed to pause, holding its breath for them. He didn't kiss her, didn't dare. But when she leaned her head on his shoulder, he felt something within him yield, a vow not made with words, but with the quiet certainty of belonging. The next morning, he rose early and walked down to the river. The sky was painted with dawn, pale blue and silver. He knelt by the water, washing his hands, trying to steady the storm inside him. When he looked up, she was standing on the bank, wrapped in her blanket, her hair catching the morning wind. "You leave?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No," he said. "I just needed to see the river." She smiled faintly and stepped closer, her bare feet brushing the cold stones. "River remembers," she said. "Always." Days passed into weeks. Her wound healed, though she still limped a little. They worked side by side, and the rhythm of life became their song. Quiet, steady, complete. He never crossed the line of what was proper, though his heart begged him to. She never asked him for more, though her eyes often lingered on his face when she thought he wasn't looking. In the hush of the Montana wilderness, they lived like two souls carved from the same silence, each incomplete without the other, yet both afraid to speak what they already knew. Then, one afternoon, riders appeared on the ridge, painted horses, feathers glinting in the light. Kaya's people had found her. Jacob stood outside, his rifle lowered, heart pounding. The chief dismounted, his face carved with years and sorrow. Kaya limped forward, calling out in her language. The old man's eyes softened, and he embraced her, murmuring words Jacob couldn't understand. The others watched him warily, unsure what to make of the white man beside her. But Kaya turned to them and said something that made them bow their heads. The chief stepped closer and looked Jacob in the eyes. For a long time neither spoke. Then the old man placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder and nodded once. No words were needed. Gratitude had no language. Jacob understood it was time to let her go. That night, the tribe camped near the river. Fires burned under the stars, and the air was heavy with smoke and drums. Kaya came to him one last time, her shadow flickering in the firelight. "You saved me," she whispered. "But more. You made me remember what kindness feels like." He swallowed hard, unable to answer. She touched his face gently. "When you look at the stars," she said, "think of me." Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. No kiss, no promise, just a sacred silence between two hearts that had met where worlds were not meant to meet. When she walked away toward her people, Jacob felt the night close around him like the river's tide, soft, inevitable, eternal. At dawn, the tribe was gone. The cabin stood quiet once more. Jacob sat by the door, holding the small pendant she had left behind, woven from river reeds and beads of bone. He turned it over in his hands, staring at the rising sun. The air was cold, the world the same, yet nothing in him remained untouched. He was still a virgin, still a loner, still a man with no name written in any story. But he had been chosen once, under the stars, and that was enough to make a legend. He stayed in the valley for years, tending the land, speaking to no one of what had happened. But sometimes, at night, he would light a fire by the river and whisper her name to the wind. And those who passed through the Montana woods would tell tales of a quiet cowboy who healed a dying girl with leaves and honey, and how she called him my chosen one, before vanishing with the dawn.